Why did the yard go quiet the moment the colonel laughed at her? No one could quite explain it later. Not the cadets frozen mid-formation. Not the instructors pretending to study clipboards. Not even the maintenance crew who had paused with tools still in their hands. Something in the air had shifted before a single word landed. Lieutenant Helena Ward stood alone on the packed dirt, a thin medical slip folded once in her hand, the morning sun pressing down on her shoulders like a held breath. She didn't argue. That was the first thing that unsettled people. The colonel's voice carried easily, practiced and sharp, the sound of a man used to rooms going quiet when he spoke. He mocked the exemption without raising his volume, like it wasn't worth the effort. Like she wasn't worth the effort. Trauma, he said, with a smile that never reached his eyes. Excuses, he implied with the faint chuckle that followed. Helena didn't react. She stood with her feet planted evenly, shoulders relaxed, gaze forward. Not defiant, not submissive, just still, too still. Most people thought that meant she was shrinking, that she was embarrassed, that the weight of his rank and his words had bent her spine inward where no one could see. It was an easy assumption, a comfortable one. People like stories where weakness explains silence. But silence can mean other things. The colonel stepped closer, invading the small space she hadn't bothered to defend. He plucked the paper from her hand and let it drift to the ground between them. The crowd shifted. A few nervous smiles flickered and died. Someone laughed, too quickly, then stopped. Helena watched the paper fall like she was cataloging a detail she might need later. Inside her chest, something tight and familiar coiled, not fear, not anger, calculation. She counted her breath the way she always did when the world got loud. In, hold, out, slow enough to stay invisible, steady enough to stay upright. She could feel eyes on her now, pity from some, curiosity from others, the sharp appraisal of people trained to notice posture, balance, readiness. A few of them sensed what the rest didn't. They felt the wrongness in the moment and didn't know why. The colonel mistook her breathing for nerves. He said her husband's name like it belonged to him. That landed. Not visibly, not in a way anyone could point to, but something behind Helena's eyes shifted like a door closing softly. Her jaw set, not in defiance but in decision. She had promised herself she wouldn't respond to provocation. She had promised herself patience, but promises didn't mean passivity. They meant timing. The blow came fast. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't loud. Just a sharp, efficient strike meant to humiliate more than injure. Bone met bone. Her head snapped sideways. The ground rushed up to meet her shoulder. Dust bloomed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. This was the moment people would replay later, the one they argued about. The second where the story could have gone a dozen different ways, where someone could have stepped forward, where outrage might have broken through rank and fear. No one did. Helena lay still just long enough to let the shock pass through her system. She tasted blood, noted the pain, assessed it the way she assessed everything. Acceptable, manageable, not the worst she'd endured. When she pushed herself up, it wasn't frantic. It was controlled, deliberate, the way someone rises who knows the ground well and doesn't intend to stay on it. That was the second thing that unsettled people. She didn't look at the colonel when she stood. She didn't scan the crowd. She wiped the blood from her jaw with 2 fingers and left a faint red smear on her pant leg like a mark she didn't bother to hide. "Yes, sir," she said when he demanded a response. Her voice didn't shake. That unnerved him more than anger would have. He dismissed her with a flick of his hand, already bored, already satisfied. He had proven something in his mind, about weakness, about authority, about where she belonged. Helena walked away at an even pace, spine straight, steps measured. The crowd parted without meaning to. No one met her eyes. A few women watched her go with something like fury burning just beneath the surface. No one spoke. Behind her, the colonel clapped his hands and called the yard back to order. Noise rushed in to fill the space she left behind, but it didn't quite settle right. Somewhere near the edge of the yard, an old sergeant major watched the ground where she'd fallen. He noticed the way the dirt had shifted, the way it hadn't sprayed or scattered like panic, the way it showed training, memory, habit. Widows didn't fall like that. Helena didn't go to medical. She locked herself in a small barracks bathroom and pressed cold water to her jaw, studying her reflection with the detachment of someone reviewing damage to equipment. The bruise would be ugly. People would see it. That was fine. Sometimes visibility served a purpose. She tested her bite, her range of motion, logged the pain. Then she reached into an inner pocket and pulled out a phone no one knew she carried. The message she sent was short, clean, unemotional. Contact made, escalation confirmed, standing by. It erased itself seconds later. Only then did she let herself lean back against the sink. Only then did she close her eyes and take a few uncounted breaths, long enough to feel the ache behind her ribs, long enough to remember a voice that used to steady her hands, long enough to feel the quiet grief that never really left. Then she straightened. The base would decide who she was by what they saw next: a fragile widow, a counselor who didn't belong, a problem that would solve itself if ignored hard enough. Helena intended to let them believe every version that made them comfortable. Because the truth would take time. And patience, she knew better than most, was not the absence of strength. It was strength held in reserve. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room is the person who doesn't react, because they're waiting for the moment when reaction finally matters. Why did the whispers follow her instead of fading? By the second morning, the bruise on Helena Ward's jaw had ripened into something impossible to ignore. Yellow bled into purple, purple into green, a slow map of violence spreading beneath her skin. She didn't try to hide it. No makeup, no scarf, just the uniform pressed and correct, and the mark of what had happened sitting plainly on her face like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. The base noticed. Whispers slid along hallways and clung to door frames. They hovered over coffee cups in the mess hall and curled around weights in the gym. They weren't loud enough to be challenged, not clear enough to be confronted. They lived in that safe, ugly middle ground where people could pretend they weren't saying anything at all. She's claiming trauma. Special treatment. Can't hack it. Helena heard fragments as she passed, felt the conversation stop just a beat too late. She didn't react. Reaction fed stories. Silence let them grow fat and sloppy. She ate alone. Oatmeal, black coffee, a banana, always the same. Routine was camouflage. Routine was control. She chose corner tables, back to the wall, eyes on the entrance without making it obvious. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit. The kind you didn't unlearn just because your cover said counselor. When she walked, people moved out of her way without realizing they were doing it. Not respect, unease, like their instincts were picking up a frequency their minds couldn't translate. The colonel made sure the tone was set. He didn't mention the strike. He didn't need to. Violence was messy. Words were cleaner. He leaned into groups with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable and seeded doubt like it was an act of leadership. Fragile, liability, a distraction. He spoke as if Helena weren't human, just an idea he was correcting. And the base listened. Not because they were cruel. Most of them were. They listened because rank had gravity, and gravity pulled opinions into place whether people wanted it to or not. Disagreeing took effort. Silence was easier. Helena felt the isolation settle around her like a second skin. There were moments, small human moments, when it pressed harder than she expected. When she passed a laughing table and felt the echo of something she'd lost. When a young soldier sat across from her in counseling and spoke about fear, about being unseen, and Helena had to focus on keeping her face neutral instead of letting the familiarity cut too deep. Ignored. That was the word that threaded itself through her days. She was ignored when she entered rooms, ignored when she offered insight, ignored in ways that were careful and professional and devastatingly effective. It was a kind of erasure that didn't leave marks but hollowed space all the same. At night, alone in her quarters, she stretched sore muscles and worked through physical therapy routines designed to look mild and harmless. Anyone watching would have seen a woman rebuilding from loss. No one saw the precision, the control, the fact that every movement was measured, counted, refined. She wore the steel pendant at all times. It rested just below her collarbone, cool against her skin. A weight she welcomed, a reminder she hadn't imagined what she knew. By the third day, the colonel escalated. He summoned her mid-afternoon, timing it so word would spread before she even reached his office. Power thrived on anticipation. He let her stand for half a minute before acknowledging her presence, eyes skimming her file like it bored him. He spoke about standards, about readiness, about distractions. Helena listened without interruption, hands folded loosely in her lap, posture straight but unthreatening. She nodded when appropriate, said yes, sir, when required. She gave him nothing to push against, and it irritated him more than defiance ever could. That was when he smiled. Tomorrow morning, he said, obstacle course. Full gear, cadets watching. Make it within time or transfer out somewhere quiet and safe. It was framed like fairness, like opportunity, like generosity. Helena understood traps. This one was clumsy, born of arrogance, but dangerous all the same. The course wasn't designed for someone easing back into physical training. It was designed to expose weakness publicly and permanently. She felt the eyes on her even there, even behind closed doors. He expected hesitation, bargaining, fear. She gave him agreement. Yes, sir. The smile he wore after that was the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. That night the base buzzed. People placed imaginary bets without meaning to. Rope climb, wall vault, mud crawl. Each obstacle became a quiet verdict waiting to be delivered. Some felt pity, others felt satisfaction. A few, very few, felt something closer to unease. Helena lay fully clothed on her bunk, lights off, listening to the distant hum of generators and the muffled sounds of base life winding down. She slept easily. She always did before something important. Anxiety wasted energy. She had none to spare. Before dawn, elsewhere on the base, someone moved through shadow with purpose. Helena didn't see it. She wasn't meant to, but she'd planned for the possibility. That was the difference between optimism and preparation. When she woke, she dressed without hurry, braided her hair tight, checked her watch. Her jaw throbbed faintly. Pain was information. She cataloged it and moved on. By the time she reached the obstacle course, the crowd was already there. More than she'd expected, cadets in loose clusters, instructors pretending indifference, even officers who had no official reason to attend. Curiosity had weight. Spectacle drew people like gravity. She stood alone at the start line. The colonel enjoyed the moment. He explained the rules loudly, clearly, projecting confidence. He was a storyteller, and this was his stage. He wanted witnesses. He wanted memory. Helena listened, eyes forward, breathing slow. When the signal came, she moved. Not fast, efficient. The first obstacles fell away beneath her like warm-up drills. Hurdles cleared without wasted motion. Footwork precise. People leaned forward without realizing they were doing it. She reached the rope climb. 30 feet, vertical, unforgiving. She clipped in, hands moving with practiced ease. The murmur around her shifted, confusion threading through it. That wasn't how novices handled gear. That wasn't how people learning did anything. Halfway up, the failure came. It was subtle, almost polite, a loosening where there should have been resistance, a whisper of metal where there should have been silence. Helena felt it instantly. Time didn't slow, but her options narrowed with crystalline clarity. Primary compromised, secondary ignored by most. She shifted her weight, released, caught, adapted. The crowd gasped as one. For a breathless second, she hung suspended between falling and climbing, arms burning, legs searching. Then muscle memory took over. She climbed using strength she hadn't planned to display so openly, touched the bell and came down the safe way, eyes never leaving the rope. When her boots hit the ground, the silence was absolute. Someone found the fault before she said a word. Equipment examined. Sabotage named. The word rippled outward, ugly and undeniable. Helena didn't look at the colonel. She looked at the course. "I'd like to finish," she said quietly. Something shifted then, not just in the crowd but in the story being told. This was no longer about proving she could belong. This was about choice. The wall vault came next. She cleared it cleanly. The mud crawl left her filthy and focused. The cargo net tested what remained in her arms and she climbed it anyway. She crossed the line with minutes to spare. Cheers broke out before anyone could stop them. Helena stood there, chest rising and falling, mud streaked across her uniform, bruised dark against her jaw. She didn't smile. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't perform victory. She had done what was asked, nothing more. As she walked away, people didn't look through her anymore. They looked at her, really looked. The colonel's face had lost something, certainty perhaps, control. Helena felt the shift like a pressure change before a storm. Inside her chest, beneath the fatigue and the ache and the old grief that never quite slept, something steadied. They were watching now. And the truth, once watched closely enough, had a way of insisting on itself. Why did surviving the course make things more dangerous instead of safer? Helena felt it before anyone said a word. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It lived in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, then resumed at a lower pitch. In the way people looked at her twice now, once out of habit and again with uncertainty. She had crossed a line she hadn't been meant to cross, not the finish line, the invisible one. The colonel didn't speak to her for the rest of the day. That silence was not mercy, it was inventory. He watched from a distance while others did the talking for him. The base buzzed with fractured narratives. Some said she'd gotten lucky. Some said the equipment failure explained everything. A few, quieter voices said nothing at all and simply replayed the moment she shifted to the secondary line in their heads, over and over, unable to unsee the competence in it. Helena cleaned up, changed uniforms, and returned to her duties as if nothing had happened. Counseling sessions, notes, polite nods in corridors. She let people reframe her as a temporary anomaly, a strange footnote that would eventually correct itself. People needed that comfort. Inside, the cost of restraint pressed harder than the physical exertion ever had. Pride tried to surface and she pushed it back down. Pride made you sloppy. Pride shortened timelines. She had learned that the hard way. There were moments, alone at night, when she pressed her fingers against the bruise and let herself feel something close to satisfaction, but she never let it stay. Because she knew what came next. It arrived digitally. That evening her personal phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No greeting, no explanation, just a suggestion. "Check your email." She did. The subject line made her pause just long enough to register the intent. It was written to sting, to provoke, to strip away nuance and reduce her to something easy to dismiss. She opened it anyway. The image loaded slowly. A still frame taken at exactly the wrong moment, mid-shift, mid-recovery, her body twisted in a way that suggested panic instead of precision. Her face caught between pain and effort, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. The caption beneath it did the rest. "Widow plays soldier. How long before she quits?" Comments stacked beneath it like debris after a collapse, some cruel, some thoughtless. A few defensive, drowned out almost immediately. Helena scrolled without reacting, saving everything with mechanical efficiency. Evidence was only useful if it was complete. Still, something cold settled behind her sternum. It wasn't anger. Anger burned fast and loud. This was sharper, cleaner. The understanding that someone had decided humiliation would succeed where force hadn't. She lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling, letting the moment stretch. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute to remember what it felt like to be known without suspicion, to be someone's person instead of someone's variable, to laugh without calculating the room. Then the minute passed. She closed that door again and reached for the secure phone. The response came quickly, calm, prepared, as if this had been expected all along. They were tightening the net. The vandalism came next. Helena found it early before most of the base had woken fully. Her locker scratched, her spare uniform destroyed, her shoes missing, replaced with something childish and pointedly humiliating. She photographed everything, every angle, every detail. No expression crossed her face. Anyone watching would have been disappointed by the lack of reaction. At breakfast, the whispers were no longer subtle. She felt them glance off her like static. She ate in silence until an old sergeant major slid into the seat across from her without asking. His frustration was evident, raw and unpolished. "This has gone too far," he said quietly. She didn't disagree, she just didn't act. Some battles weren't won by charging the line. Some were won by letting the enemy step forward one time too many. That step came sooner than she'd expected. The accusation landed like a trap snapping shut. Restricted access, equipment shed, early morning hours. The story was neat, elegant, a mirror held up and flipped to make her the culprit. Helena agreed to go with the MPs without protest. That choice confused people. They wanted denial, outrage, tears, anything that fit a script. Instead, she walked calmly through the base while speculation sprinted ahead of her, multiplying as it went. By the time she sat alone in the interview room, the story had already changed hands 3 times. She waited. When the door opened, it wasn't an MP who entered. The man who sat across from her didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The weight of authority around him was different, quieter, deeper. The kind that didn't announce itself because it didn't have to. He laid the evidence out without ceremony. Footage, logs, patterns. The truth assembled patiently while everyone else watched the wrong things. Helena listened, eyes steady, hands still. When he asked if she was ready to continue, she answered without hesitation. Yes. Waiting had never been the hard part. The hard part was letting things escalate without stepping in too early, letting the system show its fractures, letting the right eyes turn toward the cracks. The colonel made his move that afternoon. A full assembly, public final. He spoke of standards again, of order, of protecting the base. His words carried confidence, but beneath it ran something thinner now, a strain, the pressure of having to act decisively before the narrative slipped out of his control. Helena stood at the back, hands clasped behind her, face unreadable. When he announced her reassignment, administrative duties, isolation, quiet erasure, some people nodded, others shifted uneasily. The decision felt abrupt, unfinished, like a door slammed too fast. Then a new voice cut through the yard. It didn't shout, it didn't need to. The arrival was deliberate, measured steps, no rush, no spectacle, just inevitability walking across packed dirt toward a man who had confused noise for power. What followed unfolded with bureaucratic precision. Charges named, evidence presented, masks stripped away one layer at a time. The assembled soldiers watched as a story they had accepted began to unravel publicly, thread by thread. Helena moved forward only when it was time. She revealed nothing she hadn't planned to. Not anger, not triumph, just truth delivered without flourish. The helmet footage played. Silence spread across the yard like a held breath that forgot how to release. When the transport doors closed behind the colonel, the sound echoed longer than it should have. Dust hung in the air, unsettled. Helena stood very still. Relief didn't come, vindication didn't either. What came instead was a quieter weight. The knowledge that justice, once pursued, never truly ended. It only moved on to the next name. Later, alone, she crossed one off a list no one else would ever see. She didn't smile. She simply closed the book. Sometimes, the most difficult part of standing your ground isn't surviving the blow. It's staying upright long enough for the truth to arrive on its own. Why did it feel heavier after the truth came out? Helena expected noise once the transport disappeared. Shouting, questions, some kind of emotional release that would signal the end of something long and corrosive. Instead, the base fell into a strange, restrained quiet, like a room after an argument where everyone pretends the damage hasn't settled yet. People didn't know where to put their eyes. The colonel had been certainty, flawed maybe but solid. When that kind of figure collapsed publicly, it left a vacuum that didn't fill itself with justice or relief. It filled with doubt, with shame, with the slow, uncomfortable realization that many had watched the signs and chosen convenience instead of courage. Helena felt that realization ripple outward as she walked back across the yard. Some soldiers straightened when she passed. Others looked away. A few watched her with something like awe, though she hadn't asked for it and didn't welcome it. Being seen like that came with expectations, and expectations were heavy things to carry when all she wanted was quiet. Inside her quarters, she shut the door and leaned her forehead against it for a moment longer than necessary. Her body was tired in a deep, layered way. Muscles ached. Her jaw pulsed dully. Beneath that was another fatigue, harder to name. The kind that came from holding yourself together while the world tried, repeatedly, to decide what you were allowed to be. She sat on the edge of the bunk and stared at her hands. They looked ordinary, scarred in small places, strong, capable, the same hands that had held her husband's face in a hospital room 2 years earlier, the same hands that had clipped into a rope that morning and trusted training over fear. She felt proud briefly, and then the pride slipped away, replaced by something quieter and more complicated. Survival had never been the goal, truth had been. Later that evening, the sergeant major found her outside, standing near the edge of the base where the lights thinned and the hum of activity softened. The sun was low, turning everything amber and forgiving. "You all right?" he asked. It was a simple question. It landed harder than expected. "I will be," she said honestly. He nodded, accepting the answer without pushing. They stood side by side, watching cadets jog past in loose formation, laughter breaking through the tension like cracks in ice. "You could have stopped this earlier," he said after a moment. "Not accusation, observation. Filed complaints, forced an investigation." "Yes," she agreed. "But you didn't." "No." He studied her profile, the fatting bruise, the set of her shoulders. Why let it go that far? Helena didn't answer immediately. She chose her words with care. "Because I needed him to believe I was exactly what he thought I was," she said. "And because people only see patterns when they repeat. Once is an incident, twice is rumor, 3 times becomes undeniable." The sergeant major exhaled slowly. "That's a steep price." "It is." They stood in silence again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Your husband, he knew what you were capable of." Helena felt the name settle into her chest. Heavy, familiar, she nodded once. "He helped shape it," she said. "Then he trusted me to decide how to use it." That night she lay awake longer than usual. Sleep came in fragments. Images drifted in and out, dust in sunlight, the sound of boots on gravel, the echo of a voice she still listened for sometimes when the world went quiet. She didn't push the memories away. She let them come and go like weather. By morning, the base had shifted again. Official notices circulated, interviews scheduled, protocols reviewed. Accountability arrived not with drama but with paperwork and careful language. Some found that disappointing. Helena found it fitting. Real consequences rarely announced themselves loudly. She moved through her day unobstructed now. People made space for her, not out of fear but respect tinged with uncertainty. The women watched her most closely, some with questions in their eyes, some with recognition. One of them approached her near the gym, young and tense, hands clasped too tightly. "Ma'am," she said, then hesitated. "Lieutenant, I just thank you." Helena studied her for a moment, seeing the familiar strain behind the words. "For what?" "For not breaking," the woman said softly. "For showing it doesn't have to look loud to be real." Helena nodded, something warm and painful blooming behind her ribs. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Just look out for each other." The woman smiled, relief flickering across her face like light through cloud, and walked away. Later, in a quiet office with blinds half drawn, Helena met again with the man who hadn't needed to introduce himself. The conversation was efficient, clean. They spoke of reports and timelines, of next steps and fallout. At the end, he paused. "You did well," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "I did what was necessary." He studied her. That's usually what people say when they've paid more than anyone realizes. She didn't respond. When he left, she sat alone for a long time, hands folded, breathing steady. The mission was complete, the objective achieved, and yet something inside her resisted the idea of closure. Justice had been served, but grief didn't follow rules of sequence. It didn't fade just because the truth had been spoken aloud. If anything, it sharpened, now unmasked, now undeniable. That evening, she went to the chapel. Not out of faith exactly, out of habit, out of a need for stillness that didn't ask questions. The space was empty, light slanting through plain windows, dust motes drifting slowly like they had all the time in the world. She held the dog tags in one hand, the steel pendant in the other. "It's done," she said quietly. Her voice echoed faintly, returned to her unchanged. She told him what had happened, not the details. He never needed those, just the truth of it, that the lie had been exposed, that the names had been spoken, that the silence had finally been broken. "I know you, tell me to stop now," she murmured, "to let this be enough." She closed her fingers around the metal, feeling its weight. "I'm trying to listen, I really am." But she knew herself too well to pretend. Some people healed by letting go. Others healed by making sure what happened to them didn't happen again. She had chosen her way a long time ago, even if she hadn't named it then. When she left the chapel, night had settled fully. The base lights hummed softly, steady and indifferent. Her phone buzzed once. A message, brief, neutral, forward-looking. She read it, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. The work wasn't over. Back in her quarters, she packed slowly. Not everything, just what mattered. Each item placed with care, each movement deliberate. She paused once, holding the coin the sergeant major had given her earlier that day, turning it between her fingers. "A reminder," he'd said. She tucked it into her bag. At the window, she watched a group of female cadets run past, formation tight, laughter rising and falling with their strides. One of them glanced up and straightened, almost unconsciously. Helena felt something soften inside her chest. Impact wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it moved quietly, person to person, moment to moment. She turned away from the window and sat on the bunk, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Not the kind that demanded sleep, the kind that asked for honesty. She missed him. She missed the life that might have been easier, quieter, safer. She missed being known without explanation. But she didn't regret the path she'd chosen. Regret implied a mistake. This had been a cost. As she lay back and closed her eyes, one thought surfaced and stayed. Strength didn't announce itself. It endured. Why did the call come just when she thought the storm had passed? It wasn't loud. It didn't carry urgency in its tone. That was what made Helena pause with one boot half-laced, fingers resting still against the canvas. The phone vibrated once on the metal table. No repeated buzz, no insistence. Just confidence. She answered without sitting down. Yes. There was a brief silence on the other end. Not hesitation, calibration. We need you operational, the voice said. Not publicly, not immediately, but soon. Helena closed her eyes for a moment, not because she was surprised, because she was. I'm not cleared, she said, not anymore. You are, the voice replied. You just don't know it yet. She let that settle. The room felt smaller suddenly, like it had been waiting for this conversation to decide what it was allowed to be. Her bag lay open on the bunk, half a life inside it, enough to leave, enough to stay. What's the nature? She asked. Advisory, the voice said. Assessment embedded. That was a careful choice of words. She recognized it immediately. It meant watching without being seen, acting without acknowledgement, carrying responsibility without rank to shield it. I don't advise, Helena said quietly. I intervene. Another pause, longer this time. That, the voice said, is exactly why we're calling. The line went dead. Helena stood there long after the screen went dark. Her reflection stared back at her from the small mirror near the door, older than her years, sharper around the eyes, still standing. She sat down slowly and finished tying her boot. The briefing took place off base, in a space that didn't pretend to be important. No flags, no plaques, just a room with bad lighting and people who spoke in fragments because they were used to being understood without explanation. They didn't waste time praising her. That would have felt like manipulation. They laid out the facts, the fractures, the places where procedure had become performance, where protection had quietly shifted to preservation of power. Helena listened, arms folded, expression neutral. You want a conscience, she said finally, not a symbol. The man across from her nodded once. We want someone who won't flinch. She thought of the yard, the laughter, the silence that followed, the way systems revealed themselves only under pressure. Flinching isn't the problem, she said. Stopping is. They didn't argue. Her role was simple on paper, complex in practice. Observe training units flagged for misconduct, sit in on evaluations, speak privately with those who didn't feel safe being heard, file reports that wouldn't disappear into drawers. She had no illusion about how that would go. Resistance would be subtle, polite, smiles that never quite reached the eyes, doors that closed just early enough to seem accidental. Authority didn't always push back loudly. Sometimes it leaned. The first unit tested her immediately. They were careful, smarter than the colonel had been. They praised her presence publicly, thanked her for her perspective, then proceeded to do exactly what they always had, only quieter. Helena watched, took notes, asked questions that seemed harmless but forced people to slow down, to explain, to hear themselves. She saw the cracks quickly. A female cadet sidelined repeatedly for attitude. A complaint downgraded to a misunderstanding. A pattern of injuries that didn't quite match the reports filed after them. At night, Helena sat alone in borrowed quarters and recorded everything. Dates, names, context. She slept lightly, mind still running even when her body demanded rest. This work didn't give you adrenaline. It gave you patience or broke you trying. One evening, after a long day of interviews that left her chest tight and her jaw aching, she stood outside under a sky washed clean by rain. The air smelled like wet earth and metal, familiar, comforting. She pulled the dog tags from her pocket without thinking. I'm still here, she murmured. The wind answered, soft and indifferent. She wondered sometimes, what he would say about the work she was doing now, about choosing quiet impact over visible triumph, about staying close to the damage instead of stepping away once the worst was over. She imagined his voice, not romanticized, not softened by grief, practical, honest. Then do it right, he'd say, or don't do it at all. The breaking point came not with violence, but paperwork. A report she submitted vanished, not delayed, not questioned, erased. Helena didn't react outwardly. She expected this. Systems protected themselves reflexively when pressed too hard. She simply resubmitted it with attachments and copied it to 3 places that didn't share a chain of command. The response was swift. A meeting, closed door. Calm smiles sharpened just enough to cut. "You're overstepping," a senior officer said, hands folded neatly on the table. Helena met his gaze. "I'm observing. You're disrupting cohesion." She nodded. "That's what truth does before it stabilizes." He leaned back, studying her. "You could make this easier on yourself." She almost smiled. "I didn't take this role to be comfortable," she said. "I took it to be useful." The room cooled perceptibly. When she left, she felt the familiar hum of pressure building again. Not fear, anticipation. She recognized the pattern now. This was what resistance looked like when it wore a suit. That night she received a message from one of the cadets she'd spoken to earlier that week. Short, careful, grateful. "Thank you for listening. I thought no one ever would." Helena stared at the screen for a long time. This was why she stayed. Not for vindication, not for redemption, but because someone else might stand a little straighter tomorrow knowing silence wasn't their only option. The work began to ripple outward. Quiet transfers, policy reviews, commanders suddenly attentive to details they'd ignored for years. It wasn't fast. It wasn't satisfying in the way justice was often imagined. But it was real. One morning, as she walked past a training field, she saw a young woman correct an instructor, calmly, confidently, and not be punished for it. The moment was small, almost invisible. Helena stopped walking. She felt something loosen inside her chest that she hadn't realized she was still holding. That evening she sat alone again, boots off, back against the wall. Fatigue pressed in from all sides, but beneath it ran something steadier. Purpose didn't always feel good. Sometimes it just felt necessary. Her phone buzzed once more. A new assignment, a new location. She didn't sigh this time. She packed efficiently, the motions familiar now. Before leaving, she paused, looking once more at the bare room, at the faint scuff on the floor where her bag had rested, at the quiet it held. Some storms didn't end. They moved. And some people didn't chase peace. They carried it forward, one difficult step at a time. Why did the quiet feel louder than any battlefield she'd ever known? The new location didn't announce itself with gates or ceremony. No sign welcomed her. No one saluted when she stepped out of the vehicle. It was just a stretch of land bordered by weathered buildings, half-functional infrastructure, and people who had learned to keep their expectations low. Places like this existed everywhere. Places where problems were managed, not solved. Where silence had learned how to survive. Helena preferred it that way. She checked in without drawing attention, accepted temporary quarters that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old dust, and spent the first night listening. Pipes knocking, footsteps in the hallway, voices drifting through thin walls. Every place told its story if you stayed still long enough. This one spoke of exhaustion. The unit she'd been assigned to had a reputation for efficiency. On paper, they were flawless. High completion rates, minimal complaints, strong leadership continuity. That was always the first warning sign. Perfect records didn't mean healthy systems. They meant people had learned what not to write down. Helena moved slowly at first. She attended briefings, sat in the back, asked neutral questions, watched how eyes shifted when certain names were mentioned, watched who spoke freely and who waited to see which way the room leaned before opening their mouth. She noticed the same pattern she'd seen before, just refined. The pressure here wasn't loud. It didn't bruise skin. It hollowed people out. Promotions dangled like favors. Assignments reassigned quietly. Evaluations written with language soft enough to look kind and sharp enough to cut careers short. One woman stood out almost immediately. Captain Myra Alvarez, early 30s, impeccable record, calm demeanor, the kind of leader who absorbed tension so others didn't have to, the kind who smiled even when she shouldn't have had to. Helena recognized that smile. They spoke for the first time over lukewarm coffee in a corner that pretended to be private. "You don't scare easily," Myra said, not looking at her directly. Helena took a sip. "Fear's useful, panic is." Myra smiled faintly. "People here think you're temporary." "Good," Helena said. "Then they'll keep showing me who they really are." The smile didn't reach Myra's eyes. It took weeks for the truth to surface, not because it was hidden well, but because it had been normalized. Long hours without justification. Medical leave discouraged subtly. A culture where endurance was praised and limits were quietly punished. No single moment crossed a line. That was the point. Helena documented everything, built timelines, connected dots that only mattered when viewed together. She met with people late, early, anywhere they felt safe enough to speak. Some cried, some didn't. Some just looked relieved to finally stop pretending they were fine. Myra waited the longest. When she finally spoke, it wasn't dramatic. It was factual, clean. She described years of pressure, decisions she justified at the time, compromises she hadn't realized were eroding her until there was very little left. "I thought if I held it together," Myra said quietly, "I could protect them." Helena nodded. "That's how it starts." "And how it ends?" Myra asked. Helena didn't answer right away. "It ends when someone decides protection doesn't mean silence anymore." The report Helena submitted this time didn't disappear. It detonated. Not publicly, not with headlines, but in meetings that ran long, in sudden inspections, in leadership shuffled without explanation, in policies rewritten with language that couldn't be bent as easily as before. Some people thanked her, quietly. Some resented her openly, others avoided her altogether. She didn't mind. Her job wasn't to be liked. It never had been. The night before she left, she walked the perimeter alone. The air was cool, the sky low and overcast. She stopped near the edge of the grounds where the lights fell away and everything blurred into shadow. She pulled the dog tags out again, habit now more than ritual. "I think this one mattered," she said softly. She imagined the response, not as a voice but as a feeling, the steady weight of trust, the reminder that doing the right thing rarely felt clean or complete. When she returned to her quarters, there was a message waiting. No assignment this time, no urgency. Just a line of text from a number she didn't recognize. "You didn't just change policy. You changed permission." Helena read it twice, then set the phone down. The next morning, as she packed, Myra knocked once on the open door. "I put in my transfer," she said. Helena looked up. "You don't owe me an explanation." "I know," Myra replied. "I just wanted you to know I'm choosing something different." Helena held her gaze. "That takes more courage than staying." Myra nodded, emotion flickering briefly before she mastered it. "Thank you for not letting me believe endurance was the same as strength." After Myra left, Helena finished packing slowly. This time when she closed her bag, it didn't feel like running. It felt like continuity. She didn't know where she'd be sent next. She didn't ask. Some paths only made sense when followed, not mapped. As the vehicle pulled away, Helena watched the base recede into the distance. Another place altered just enough to matter. Another quiet shift in a system that would never be perfect, but might be better than it was yesterday. She rested her head against the window and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, the exhaustion didn't feel hollow. It felt earned. She thought of the yard, the laughter, the moment she hadn't reacted when the world expected her to break. She thought of all the women who would never know her name, but would feel the difference anyway. Legacy, she realized, wasn't about being remembered. It was about changing what people believed they were allowed to endure. When the road curved and the light shifted, Helena opened her eyes. She was still moving forward. And she finally understood the truth she'd been living all along. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.